Right, so we're now at a point where we can actually deploy our Django project into production, and we're going to be using Digitalocean app platform because it makes it really easy to just focus on our code and nothing else, right? So there's a whole team of operations that could potentially run this code for us on servers or virtual machines. We don't have to worry about any of those things with App Platform. So let's go ahead and take a look at the blog post first. So that, of course, is at this link right here. So be sure to check out this blog post going forward. This, to me, is going to be my #1 reference personally for deploying Django on DigitalOcean, which means I will update it from time to time. And so if we scroll down here, the first step is to deploy an app component. We'll talk about that in a second. But what you'll notice in here is forking the Try Django 3.2 project. I actually think you should 100% do this with me so that you can at least get something working. I've already tested this multiple times, and it's going to be for a specific branch that I know that works. Now, of course, if you follow along perfectly to everything we've done in Try Django so far, then you will already have this branch essentially. So inside of 33-end, that's the branch we'll end up using, which in this case is production-1. Okay, so why is it that I'm not showing you how to actually push the Git code again or use your actual code? Well, it has to do with the challenges of the first few configuration hurdles that you might go through whenever deploying into production. And so all of us using the same code will mean that that code will be the best it possibly can in order to go into production. And if you put that in conjunction with this guide right here, I think it's going to be fairly straightforward on deploying your first Django application. And I'm assuming this is your first Django application, right? So if you've already deployed several times or hundreds of times, you probably can breeze through this guide itself and get things set up pretty painlessly. So let's go ahead and get this going. First off, of course, sign up for DigitalOcean. You'll get a $100 credit, which essentially means that you can learn how to do all this stuff for free. And signing up for a new account is how you get that. Next, of course, you're going to want to sign in and sign up for GitHub. And then we're going to go ahead and actually fork this code here. So if I go into GitHub, I actually am in a different user account, right? So if I look at my profile here, I have a different user account than my primary one, okay? So this is on purpose. This is so that I can go to cfe.sh/GitHub and navigate to the repository specifically for Try Django 3.2. So of course, if you have to search for it, just search for it. This is not going to necessarily work for other versions of Try Django is kind of the point. And so in here, I'm going to go ahead and click on main, and I want to filter for production. Now, I do intend to have more production branches in the future, but of course, we're going to want to start with production-1 at some point. But I don't have to do that yet. Instead, what I need to do is this thing called forking. So if I fork this code, it's actually going to bring a copy of it with all of the history of changes right into my own account, as we see here, right? So it's now showing me Team CFE. In your case, it's going to show you your username and that it was forked from that code right here. So this is actually pretty cool. So this means that I can actually come in here and edit something, and it won't actually affect the Try Django code, the official Try Django code, right? So if I actually, let's say, for instance, I wanted to print out debug in here. So I go in to edit this file. I can actually go in and say print debug and scroll all the way to the bottom and just hit commit changes. And what I'll see is that this code, of course, has this print debug. And then, of course, if I go back into the Try Django code for the exact same thing, it's not going to have print debug. Hopefully that's fairly obvious that that's happening, but you can kind of treat this code as if it's your own, which I think is actually really nice. Okay, so with this, we can now jump into DigitalOcean's app platform to create our first app. Now, when you log in, you're going to want to go over to Manage and then Apps, and you'll see this page right here. Notice that we are getting like basically a production app starting at $12 a month. And that includes the CDN-backed static sites, which I think is amazing. So there are other costs that might come into this. So you might be looking at $25 a month maybe for a pretty standard production Django application. But for comparison, my website can range from $300 a month to $1,000 a month just on the actual hardware and the hosting of the code itself based on the scale that I have. So $25 a month is really not that bad. But of course, you can do a lot of this stuff for free just to learn. It's just kind of getting a gauge for what things cost. There's also this huge added cost to trying to do things other than App Platform, right? So you can use these droplets in here. So what droplets are is essentially a virtual machine. So you can absolutely create a virtual machine, but what you end up doing then with any of these Linux distributions, you will have to actually manage it yourself, right? So you can come down to $6 a month for that. It's a pretty solid machine for $6 a month. You can even go even cheaper than that, $5 a month. Those are great machines, but then it adds another layer of complexity that App Platform doesn't have. So that layer of complexity means you have to set up everything on that machine to make it run. In this case, it won't do that, which I think is great. So let's go ahead and launch our app. Like DigitalOcean handles all of this, right? So next thing is, of course, we're going to choose our source. In this case, it's GitHub, right? So there are other ways to deploy code, and I'm sure this will probably grow as well. GitHub will most likely be here for a long time. So let's click on GitHub, and in my case, I actually deactivated the authorization. So I need to reactivate the authorization. Yours might even ask you for authorization in the first place, which is really just connecting our DigitalOcean account to our GitHub account. And so you can also select specific repositories that you want in here, right? So in my case, I could select the Try Django 3.2. I'm just going to go ahead and give it all repositories because it's going to be a lot easier to deploy things then. Now I'm going to go ahead and install and authorize. Now, of course, if you want to revoke access to any third-party service like DigitalOcean, you could just do that on GitHub. It actually wouldn't happen inside of DigitalOcean itself. And if you did do that, you would see something like I just did. Okay, so now let's go ahead and select our source. And we're going to choose our repository in here. Of course, it's teamcfe/Try Django 3.2. Now, again, it's not going to be this for you. It's going to be your GitHub username. That's important, of course. And then the branch, well, the branch is something we already talked about, and that's going to be production 1. And we also want to auto-deploy code changes. This is actually something we will talk about when we get into branch of production 2 a lot more. But for now, we'll leave it in as, production 1 and go from there. So now it's going to go ahead and grab that code and bring it over to DigitalOcean, or at the very least, review the code. And right off the bat, it recognizes that we have a Python application detected. This is really nice because, well, I didn't have to define anything here. Right off the bat, I don't have to define anything. How amazing is that? Okay, so there is something I do want, though. Notice that I've got this run command called gunicorn. I've got a build command, which we are going to leave empty. And then I have environment variables also are going to leave empty at this point. So really, I'm just going to accept all of the defaults here. Now, we can also add a database right now. This is probably a good idea. So let's go ahead and add database. Now, the name we choose here is important for environment variables later. This, of course, is referenced on this guide as well, but we are going to go ahead and just leave it as DB. But if you call it MyDB, just make sure that you remember that it's a different name. I will definitely point that out as we go forward. And in this case, I'm going to just use a really small database, which, it says it's not really a production-ready version. I think this would be fine for a brand new project that has no users, right? So if you start to get users, then you're going to want to provision an upgrade to a better database later, which is what it's saying, right? So let's go ahead and add this database. And now we have 2 components to this app, right? So this is actually how App Platform works, is it thinks of each part of the entire app as a component to it, right? Now, that might be a little confusing with Django because Django itself has a Django project, which is a web application, and that inside of that web application has sub apps, right? App itself is just something that's used so much. But anyway, so think of your entire project as an app, and then each piece of it being a component of that app, which also gives me something really cool. And that is if I did have other applications in here, like let's say, for instance, I wanted to have a fast API or a Flask application inside of this app as well, that is possible with App Platform and how these HTTP route requests work, which I think is really cool too. But that's getting a little bit more advanced, something we don't need just yet. So I'm going to go ahead and hit next to launch this application. I'm going to leave the default name of Django 3.2, and then also the region. Typically speaking, you're going to want the region to be as close to where you think your users are going to be as possible. Now, this is for just running the code. It's not necessarily for static components, which they have a global CDN for. We'll talk about that later when we actually get static components. And the other part of this is we are going to have this example here. This right here is going to be what our app domain name will be, or something like this, once it actually goes into production, which I think is pretty cool, but also something we need to be aware of with our Django project as it relates to the allowed hosts, right? So another reason to have this setting inside of environment variables for this particular project. Anyway, so let's go ahead and go to the next one. And of course, this will take a moment to actually provision after we finalize everything. So yes, I need to use the basic. I can't use starter because it's not a static site. It actually has a dynamic application, which means it's going to run Python essentially. And it's going to be per hour metrics, but it's also paid per hour. So if you only run this for let's say for instance, 2 days, you're not going to pay $5. You're going to pay whatever the 2-day equivalent of that would be. And I'm going to actually use the $5 a month container, still saying at $5, right? So it actually brings me into $10 a month, which, is still this basic app, but we kind of decide how much power we want. I think $5 a month is fine. And as we see, the monthly cost at this point is, $12 a month. Really, really not much. Now, I realize if you've never actually managed and deployed a project in production before, this might seem like a lot because you can actually host a lot of static websites that is just HTML and CSS for free. Even GitHub allows you to do that. So this kind of feels like a lot, but if you think about it, a actual really powerful server is going to be running your Python application or any of these applications 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with probably no downtime. There's a really high probability that there's no downtime unless it's something you did on your code. So I think that is well worth it personally. And I mean, this is true for a lot of services that, fit in this category of just deploying code is $12 a month. Even if it was $30 a month, you'd still be saving so much time actually getting this going. So here comes one of the things that you'll have to get used to waiting for, and why the setting of, automatically building when we deploy it. So if you go into settings, this auto deploy code changes being enabled. This is actually one of the reasons that you want this, is because the building process is going to take some time, right? So if I was actually pushing my code to DigitalOcean, for example, directly to it, instead of pushing it to Git, then this would still take a lot of time, but perhaps it would be sitting there on my terminal waiting for everything to finish. And I definitely do not want that to happen. Okay, cool. So while it's building, the thing we can do is we can actually look at the deployments and we can see the details for it. Now, this build is actually going to fail. I know why it's going to fail, or there's several reasons as to why it's going to fail. But the very first one has to do with disabling the collect static command. Something we haven't gone over yet is there's a command inside of Django called collect static. Now, what this is doing is something we will cover later. But typically speaking, when you deploy to a service like App Platform, you are automatically going to have it run that command of collect static. It's not something I need at this point. Maybe in the future I'm going to want to bring it back, but for right now I don't. So this actually brings me into one of the primary steps here, which would be provisioning the app level environment variables. Okay, so what we have so far up here is almost correct. I did leave out one piece of it. That's okay. We'll come back to that. But now what we want to do is provision the app level environment variables, because that's actually what happened. That was the error that we just saw, which, it just takes some time to get used to. But what you see right here is actually giving you that problem. So it's right here. And it says improperly configured. You're using the static files app without having the static root setting to a file system path. It's like, what does that error even mean? Yeah, we'll talk about that later. But anyway, so let's go ahead and set an environment variable for disable collect static on the app itself. So the entire app level environment variable. So going into settings, clicking on app itself, and of course app settings, we're going to go to app level environment variables. We're going to go ahead and edit. We're going to put disable collect static. And of course it says equal to 1, but really 1. Now, of course, in programming, most of the time, 0 means false, 1 means true. Now, of course, you could also verify this. I'm going to just verify it for you. You could say 1 equals to true, and you get a true value. 0 equals to true. You get a false value, right? So it's just a really simple and easy way to give a true-false value without knowing if it's lowercase true, capital true, or if those are actually Boolean values themselves, or what if it's like, hey, this is the name of my project. It's just called true. That might happen. So we use a 1 in this case. Okay, so I do not need to encrypt this at all. I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'm going to let the component actually update again. So I do anticipate yet another error, but before I even look at the build process, what I see here is this app spec. So this app spec right here is actually giving the DigitalOcean system, the entire system, everything that's going on and everything we've done to this point. So what we see here is we've got a database with an engine of PG, which stands for Postgres, and then it says our name. So if you used a different name, it would show that, size and all that stuff, the name of our entire app project, or our, the actual app itself up here, which includes our Django project as well as our database. But then it gives you all of these other things, right? So it's actually showing you what's going on here. Granted, I might need to refresh the page to have all of the environment variables correct. So let's go ahead and just do that. Refresh the page. So my app spec is reflecting that, recently added environment variable. And there it is. Right. So what we see here is we've got this on build and runtime, which is cool. But notice that it's coming in, the value is coming of 1 is coming in as a string. That again goes back to that true false thing as to why we use 1 versus anything else. Django will understand the environment variable of it being equal to a string of 1, which, going back to our debug settings, is also why I did that good old string of 1. Literally the same reason. Okay, cool. So now this service is building still. We go back into the deployment itself, and we should get further than we did before. Like, it shouldn't error out like it did because we disabled that first error. Now, the reason I'm showing you these errors now versus in this post, these posts doesn't show the errors at all. It just tells you to set all of these things up. The reason I'm showing you them is so that you can be prepared when you run into these errors. And if you're like me, you're going to skip steps and guides all the time. You're going to just be like, oh, I kind of know what to do, so I'm just going to go for it. So you should be expecting to see certain kinds of errors. That's why we're doing this, not so much of like the tediousness of watching something build and then, trying to diagnose the error. That's not any fun. I'm going to let it actually go until it hits that error, which might be a few minutes, but let's go ahead and let that happen. Feel free to step away for a moment, but I'm really just going to pause it, step away from your DigitalOcean for a moment. In my video, I'm going to pause it and we'll come back. Okay, in my case, it's already been a few minutes. It says it just built the container image. I'll explain those things later, but it built everything, but it's still not fully done. It is saying that it's deploying. I just wanted to check in. And yet again, it failed to deploy, as I mentioned before. So if we take a look at the logs, let's go and take a look at the deployment logs, the actual error. No application module specified. Now, this might be something you're not familiar with. I would guess it's not something you're familiar with. So let's go back into history so we can see the whole thing. Go into details. And if we, it's not actually letting me scroll down, but I think that error actually happens right after the build is complete. And then we go into deployment. We've got no application module specified. So going back into our settings here, what we need to specify is inside of our component of try Django, and we need to update our run command. right? So GUnicorn right here has to know about what I'm trying to run. What it's not doing is actually picking the Django project itself. Because if you think about our development commands, right? So in our development commands, it's Python manage.py run server, right? So this actually runs the development server. GUnicorn is slightly different, right? So GUnicorn, in your case, and my case as well, I don't actually have GUnicorn installed on my virtual environment, but I do have it on my machine, so it's saying this as well. So when I just type out GUnicorn, it says no app module specified. Now, if you're on Windows, GUnicorn will not install unless you use something like Docker. But if you just see that this is the error, that's what's happening. And so if we come back into our deployments here and we were to Google this, we might actually see that error. So let's go ahead and say app platform, no application module specified. And so it might actually show it. In this case, it's getting it right here, right? It actually is showing GUnicorn. So trying to diagnose that error is not necessarily the easiest thing to do. But luckily, I know exactly what it is, and I just showed it to you. So errors like that are certainly frustrating. And if you see errors that are not talked about in this, just let us know, and maybe all of us can solve it together. So going back into our settings, we're going to go into try Django 3.2, and we're going to go ahead and update this run command. I'll hit edit here. And what we have to do is we're going to leave this worker temp directory in here. What we have to do is declare the Wsgi module that we want to use. So looking back at our code, the Wsgi module is inside of try Django, and it's this right here. That stands for Web Server Gateway Interface. This is just really where the application itself is declared, right? So GUnicorn is going to look in here for this application. So we need to just write out the path to it. So in my case, it's tryDjango.wsgi, and that should solve it, just that alone. Now, if I had this named something different like app, then I might actually have to come in here and say :app. But I have it in there as application. That's what Django does by default. So we really shouldn't have to change it much from here. So now I'm going to go ahead and save that. Notice that it's updating the component. Now, in the case of the command, it may or may not need to rebuild the entire thing, but it looks like it is, right? I actually think this should go a little bit faster because the error that happened was related to that command and not actually the application itself. So you might be wondering, like, why would a build even take a while at all? And actually, it's because of a platform that, app platform uses this technology called Docker. So Docker itself is a way to isolate code on a much more advanced level than a virtual environment. So what app platform is doing is actually running a Docker image. So that means that when it is being built, it actually does take a while to build it properly. And that's why we're seeing this stuff while it's being built, right? So if we come back in here, that's why we're seeing these like layers and images and, pushed built image to the container registry. All of that stuff is related to Docker. But the thing to notice here is we're not managing anything related to the Docker component itself. Now, you totally can. You can actually deploy Docker, files. You can do all of the Docker images yourself on App Platform, which is a little bit more advanced than what we need to do here. But this is one of the things that I really like about App Platform is the fact that it is built in Docker. So if I needed to update or change the environment that is running my application, like the actual operating system, I can do more things there, which is really cool. So if I need to use something like OpenCV or some sort of deep learning library, and for whatever reason, requirements.txt is not working, I can actually add things related to Docker to make it my own environment in that way, which is really cool. So I just wanted to mention that as just another benefit of using App Platform. So as we see now that it was deployed successfully. Okay, so all I did was just change that one single command. Okay, so inside of here, this run command is going to take effect after the image is built. The build command is another one that you might be like, oh, well, that's actually something I want to address. I actually want to have a build command for a number of items. But before we get there, I have to update all of my other virtual environment items here, right? So, or excuse me, my environment variable items here. So here's a good example of those things right here, right? So we've got debug being 0, right? So we want to be in production. So debug being 0. I need to update the allowed host. I need a secret key, a new Django secret key, a more secure one, and certainly not one that is on GitHub, right? Let's see, what's after that? We need a super user, email, username, and password. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then we'll talk about the database stuff shortly after that. So what I'm going to do is just, collapse this guide down a little bit, just so we can see both things at the same time. And then we'll collapse this down a little bit. There we go. And so I'm going to just come back into my app level environment variables and hit edit. And we're going to just add key value pairs in here. Of course, if you need to see the full screen, it's going to be like that. So maybe I can just collapse this down a little bit more to make it easier to read. Okay, so debug being 0. Okay, and let's go ahead and add another one. And that's going to be allowed host. Now the host itself can be on these domains right here. So you can actually declare this one specifically, or if you just want to be a little bit more, robust in the sense that it could be any DigitalOcean application, you could do that, right? So being explicit about the actual host is a good idea, but if you want to allow all of these subdomains, you just put a period in front of it. It's kind of the point of that. Next, we'll do the actual email. So in this case, I'll just use hello@teamcfe.com. And then let's go ahead and add another one for username. And I'll just use CFE. And then the other two are going to be the secret key and a super user password. Okay, so both of these I'm going to want to encrypt. Of course, I don't have them yet. So the question is, how do we actually make those happen? Right, so there is a really simple command to do this. Let me just scroll up a bit on this guide here. And it looks like maybe I left it in the other guide. But the command itself, if we go back into the prepare Django 3, we can actually scroll down a bit and we will be able to grab this right here. Okay, so I'm pretty sure I talked about that in that video, but let's go ahead and grab it again and jump into our application where Django is installed and run Python, or actually paste this command in here. And of course, if we paste it several times, it will give us a bunch of different secret keys. So the very first one, or any of these, we'll just use as our secret key. Now you can absolutely, and you should, change these secret keys from time to time. Next, we're going to use the next one as our password. And I actually want to make reference of this in a new file. So just so I can actually log in later. And now I've got all of that stuff. Okay, cool. So the next thing is I actually, before I even save everything, I am going to go down to the provision your database. Now in our case, we already created the database, so I don't need to provision it. Instead, I want to update the app level environment variables with these items right here. Okay, so it's 5 items. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And certainly we actually now do not need to encrypt anything. So the first one is going to be the Postgres database. Next, of course, is the host. This, of course, is the database name itself. The username, password, and port. Now, thinking back to our actual code inside of settings.py, all of those should actually be in here already, right? And that should be true for the code that we used anyway, so the code that we forked. So these are all in here, and assuming if I add values in here, then Django is going to try and connect to that database. So where do we actually get these values? Now, there's a couple of ways on how we can do it, but first I'm going to show you something that's really cool, is we can use this string substitution key here. So it's $ curly brackets db.database, and then we kind of finish the whole thing out. So host name for the host, username, password, and the port. So the nice thing about these is if I change my database or I upgrade my database, this will work with one exception. I just need to change what this variable is right here. Remember when we actually provisioned that database, this is where you would actually change it from DB to MyDB or whatever that component's name is. So of course, I'm going to leave it in as DB because that's how I had it. And we don't need to encrypt any of these things because when DigitalOcean actually tries to inject these environment variables, it is going to change that data for me. So now I'm going to go ahead and save it. And let's go ahead and open this up again. And what's going to happen, of course, is going to rebuild this. And what we should also see is my app spec update. So let's go ahead and just refresh our settings. And so this app spec is also really good for the fact that if I ever accidentally delete this application on DigitalOcean, I can just reuse this app spec in there. So we can absolutely use that locally and just keep it. It's kind of like, hey, this is a history, or we're tracking all of the data about this entire app, which is great. Okay, so here's that DB or that database, right? And what we could have done is wrote all of those same credentials in here manually. Now, I don't recommend you do this, right? But you absolutely can, right? So we could have used that host here, the port and so on, username, database. So instead of using those environment variables that we replaced, so coming back into there, right here, right? So we could absolutely come down to Postgres itself and, add in, I think this was the host maybe. We could have put that right there, right? Instead. And that actually would work, but it's not recommended because it's not flexible and it's also exposing some of that data potentially because, again, it's inside of this app spec here. So yet another potential vulnerability. Now, the encrypted ones are not like that, right? So these are encrypted also on the app spec. So just a cool thing to know about, and definitely a nice thing to know about that it's encrypted and it's not going to be a security issue, most likely. Okay, so there is still something that's major that we haven't done yet that we still need to do, and that is adding one more component for running a job. So this is before or after any given deploy. And so what we need is to run a job related to our Django project right before it is deployed. So what this means is the image is going to be built. So the actual Docker image is going to be built. And then we want to run a command on it. So in this case, I'm using the exact same repository and branch. We're going to go ahead and hit next. And same Python, application, all of that stuff. Notice that now I actually have 12 environment variables. These, of course, are all related to the app level environment variables, which is key here, mainly for the database stuff, but potentially for some of these other aspects as well. So what I actually want to put in here is related to running Django. So back into that guide, we actually see the two commands that we need to put in here, right? So if I copy this, I'm going to go ahead and bring it into my run command. I do not need to run gunicorn in this case because it's really just going to run it once and then be done. It's not going to continuously run. It's not like our web application itself. So these two commands are the ones we want to run. The first one is migrate, and then the second one is create superuser, and it's going to do it based off of this email as well as a few other environment variables. But that's really the key here is we want to run these commands. You might have other commands you want to run on here like python manage.py collect static. Perhaps you want to put it in here if you forgot as to where you put it, or any other custom management commands that you might have at some point. So this is where we're going to be running these things. This is how it's set up. Now, it doesn't show me just yet as to what it's going to be doing, right? So let's call this try Django, and let's call this my Django migrate job. Hit next. Still basic. It's all the same information, right? We can now bring it down to an hourly rate. Now, this job, notice that it says additional monthly cost of $0 to $5. It's going to take a little bit of time, and they're just going to charge you for that little bit of time. Most likely, this is going to be $0 for you, depending on how often you're deploying. So if you deploy maybe 10,000 times a day, which is probably not even possible, you're going to see a higher monthly cost. But the chances are really good you're going to see nothing. Unless, of course, your commands are really big and they are really long. So I'm going to go ahead and create this job. And I actually didn't organize when the job came out. So if I click on it now, what I see is the job trigger is after a successful deploy. No, we actually want it before every deploy. But notice that we also have a failed deploy. So if we had a command or something that we wanted to trigger when it did fail, that is pretty cool. We can actually do that in here. We would just need to make sure that the command itself is running correctly. But of course, we don't need to use that same source code. We could use other things as well. But I don't know how often you're going to end up doing that as a beginner. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and leave it in as every deploy. Okay, so what this means now is it's going to run a migrate command when we deploy it. So this is really important for our database. The create super user one probably only needs to be ran one time. So this command is really nice because if we go back into our project and run it, what it's going to say is we need to use username with no input. Now, we actually added that username already, and this is a feature of newer versions of Django. I think it might have came in Django 3.0, but at least in Django 3.2 and above, if we add these environment variables here of the username and the user password, the command of create super user -- no input with the email will absolutely work. I actually had to put in the email with this no input, even though I had the environment variable like the docs say for that email. But at this point, what it will end up doing is it will at least create that user for me. Now, of course, that's not the only way to create a super user because you have this cool thing called console right here that would allow you to jump into any given component that has a runtime. In our case, it's just our application. We can actually see all of our code in here, and I could still run all of those commands as needed. So that actual create super user probably does not need to be in that job is kind of the point, but it certainly can be. The other cool thing about this is we can actually use the production level, Python manage.py shell, and we can import the things that we need to import. So from articles.models, we can import everything and do articles.objects.all and hit enter. Oops, not articles, but rather article, the model name itself. And of course, in this case, I actually get an error because I have no such table. That, of course, is because it's still building this service. Once it finishes building that service, then it's going to run our job. So going back into our components themselves, right? So it's going to build the try Django 3.2 service. Then it's going to run this job right before it deploys it. Once all of that's done, then this will be complete. It will assume that it's complete. And at that point, the database should be well migrated, which I think is really cool. I'm going to pause and let that finish. All right, so it's still building, but I wanted to mention this right here. Okay, so Python released a security update. Consider upgrading to Python 3.6.13. So this is great. It's showing that I have, an outdated version of Python 3.6. Now, eventually, it'll probably tell me that I shouldn't even use Python 3.6, but it's nice to see that my production level service is alerting me to this fact. Now, to change this, it's really easy to do. I'm not going to do it just yet, but I will show you how to do it in a moment. I just wanted to point this out where it's not exactly an error, but it is certainly something that we need to be aware of for these security issues. Now, it can be an error. So if you use a really old version of Python, there's a good chance that it will actually error out. So if you used Python 3.6.1, for example, it might actually run an error and say this Python version is no longer supported at all. But of course, these upgrades, these security updates, sometimes take a while for other services like your service that you're building right now to actually adopt. So, there's not really a hard hey, you cannot use this version of Python. And if you really need to use any given version of Python, then you would actually be using Docker. So yet another reason to use Docker is you can be very specific about what your Python version is, what are those operating systems could be. And what do you know? It's actually running now. So let's go ahead and, well, of course, not open some sort of local host server running, but rather the actual application itself. So it looks like it's still deploying. It might need another moment for the final service to run. But of course, we can still go to this URL because a previous version may or may not have been working. At this point, of course, I'm seeing a server error, which is something we will address in the future by getting emails and whatnot of these server errors. But now it just deployed successfully, so let's refresh this. And yet again, I'm still getting a server error. So let's go ahead and look into the admin. Now the server error appears to be related to the home page. So inside of the admin, let's actually log in with that user that I created, and I left this password right here, or attempted to create. So let's go ahead and log in. Still getting a server error. So it's possible that the actual job did not happen, right? So let's go ahead and go into the console and take a look. So I'll go ahead and run Python manage.py, migrate, hit enter. And this is actually showing me that job never ran. Okay, so going back into my settings, we see that this job right here just simply didn't run because, well, perhaps when we created it, there was already another deployment being built, another component of the Django 3.2 being built where this settings just never took hold. So what we can do, of course, is actions. And, well, we could try deploy. That might work. But I would say actually force build and deploy is probably going to be the best bet. Right? I'm not positive if this would actually do those commands in there, but it's worth testing. I think when in doubt, it's the force build and deploy, and potentially even, oh, there we go. It's actually showing it. Cool. So now it's actually running that job. Now, since I ran migrate on the console, I should actually see no errors anymore. So I don't actually have a server error showing up any longer. And if I go into the admin, what I should have a problem with is still logging in, right? So now it's just saying the username and password are incorrect. And of course, it's running that job and then going to start that service. Once it does all of that, then it's going to finalize the deployment, and then we'll actually be able to log in with that user because this command would have run at that point, which is nice. So the other cool thing to think about with this is that perhaps we change these components and just run deploy and not have to rebuild our entire, web application all over again. But now that it's been fixed, let's go ahead and try to log into the admin, and I'm getting another login error. So in this case, yeah, I probably want to actually force rebuild and deploy, clear out that build cache, hit deploy, and just run that all over again. So I'm going to go ahead and pause it and let it finish. And there we go. So it deployed successfully. Let's take a look now. And hopefully this time it actually works and we don't have some major error. Still getting this 500 error. So this, of course, is something related to either the database or something else. So perhaps it will be a good time to introduce our actual email settings so that we can get this diagnosed to what the problem possibly is. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the console log and run migrate again. Let's just see if this actually runs the same thing. This is actually the problem right here. And so it's actually showing me that it is attempting to migrate again. So what that's telling me is that I actually do not have the environment variables up correctly. So let's go back into my settings here and let's just take a look at the environment variables. So it's probably something related to these and the fact that my code might be slightly different than that. So let's go into my code that we got here, and I'm going to just pop it out and break it down a little bit just to see if all of these environment variables are actually in these settings. So let's grab the DB first. Sure enough, there it is. And the host. That's correct. And I found it. It is the user. This should say user and not username. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. I am 100% going to have the blog post open, so it's updated for this. But it's a good chance that yours was already updated and you already had the correct data in those environment variables. Now, this is one of those things that's a little tricky. So one of the ways I also would have considered solving this is to flip this debug to being true, right? So adding in emails would actually send me an email of the server error itself. I could also set up logging, other kinds of logging to get that error as well. But the emails are really easy way to diagnose it, but it requires me to do a bunch of other configuration. So switching this debug would probably have told me something related to the server is not correct, right? So I ran migrate in the console, which allows this to work again or to show up, but it's just creating a SQLite 3 database, which we could actually verify going back into the console. It's still building this service. I can list things out, and I actually see db.SQLite 3, right? So if I remove that and try to do this again, even whatever it is, I'm going to get that same server error. So what it's basically saying is it cannot connect to the database. I believe that's what the server error would end up being. But at this point, it's definitely related to the database. So again, I'll let that finish and then we'll come back. Okay, so it finished again. Let's take a look. Oops, I don't think that's the right password. Let's just grab that again. Woohoo, yeah. Okay, so now it seems to be working completely. So let's go into the console itself again and run Python manage.py migrate. Now it should say, well, this little warning is from that .env file, probably, as you may already know, and we have no migrations to apply. That's great. So we now have everything set up as intended. So one of the things to note is I really wanted to do this with no coding whatsoever. I didn't want to use Git, version control. I didn't want to do any of that other than the basics that we did with GitHub, mainly because I wanted to show you that deploying onto App Platform is, well, something you can do without the code. So once you get your project up to a point, you can actually move it over to App Platform in a fairly painless way. Now, migrating a database is not always as simple, but the general idea here is we now have that application running in production. So hopefully you're really excited about that. And also hopefully you have some strategies on actually solving some of the errors that happened through this process. But now that these errors are mostly taken care of, there's something that we need to start thinking about, and that is automating testing, or actually testing these problems, right? So one of the reasons that mine wasn't working correctly was because of the environment variables not being written out correctly, right? So that simple environment variable being the wrong key value caused, well, catastrophic effects. So that's one example of something we probably should be testing. Another example would be the actual code itself to ensure that everything related to the code is working. And so writing tests is not a trivial thing whatsoever, but what we can start to think about is not only writing tests on our local project to handle a lot of those things, but also to write tests so that when we push it to GitHub, that it actually monitors those changes. It actually verifies that changes have happened so that if the tests fail, it never even attempts to build a brand new application. And that's really the key here, is we want to prevent building poorly designed applications at all, or little glitches and mistakes and stuff like that. So the real key here was to convince you that writing tests is going to be well worth it, and also to show you how cool it is to have an actual project live and in production.